A very good evening to you. My name is Yvonne Okwara Matole, and this is our big story tonight. After 1 week of drama that shrouded Miguna Miguna's arrival from Canada and his forced return to Dubai, many are still asking whether he is Kenyan or Canadian. Where exactly did the confusion arise? And why was he cleared to run as governor by the very same state that declares him a foreigner only months later after the general election? Tonight on The Big Story, we'll look at the issue of dual citizenship and leadership in Kenya. Who's eligible for dual citizenship and what are the benefits and the restrictions? We will be taking a look at that in just a moment. In studio tonight are two advocates of the High Court, Steve Ogola and Degwanjiru. And we will be speaking to our lead reporter, Sophia Wanuna, as well. She will be just breaking down the highlights of the appearance by both the CS and the PS, the Ministry of Interior and the PS for Immigration, before the Parliamentary Committee on National Security tonight. So we'll be analyzing their statements, particularly surrounding the issue of dual citizenship and leadership, and asking whether this is really what's at the heart of the matter tonight. But before we get into our conversation and before we speak to Sophia Wanuna, there's been quite a bit of discussion on social media about dual citizenship, when it applies, before 2010, after 2010. So let's take a look at what the Constitution has to say regarding particularly citizen and leadership, because a number of questions come up. If, for example, Miguna Miguna had been declared winner of the Nairobi gubernatorial race, would we now be talking of deporting a sitting governor? Well, this is what the Constitution says, that a person is not eligible for election or appointment to a state office unless the person is a citizen of the country, and that a state officer or member of the Defense Forces shall not hold dual citizenship. And those clauses do not apply to judges and members of commissions. You'll remember Commissioner Kombe of the IEBC, or any other person who's made a citizen of another country by operation of that country's law without the ability to opt out. This is according to the Constitution of Kenya, which was promulgated in 2010. And if you take a look once again at the Leadership and Integrity Act, that also continues to speak about this issue of leadership and citizenship. Of course, subject to Article 78 of the Constitution, a state officer who acquires dual citizenship will lose his or her position as a state officer. So that's just taking a look at the Leadership and Integrity Act and the Constitution of Kenya and what it says. Like I said at the beginning, Miguna Miguna was a man who ran for office of governor in Nairobi. He did not win, but if he did, perhaps the circumstances today might have been different. Who knows? So let's take a look at what the requirements are for running for office in this country. You must be at least a citizen for 10 years. And important to note, you must not owe allegiance to any foreign state. Obviously, you must be a registered voter, this you know. And you must be eligible for election as a member of a county assembly in the county in which you are seeking the gubernatorial seat. And then, of course, it goes on to talk about being a holder of a degree from a recognized university. And then there's the other rules and regulations there regarding their imprisonment. Okay, so important to note that one who wants to run for the office of governor must not owe allegiance to a foreign state and therefore obviously cannot be a dual citizen. So those are just a list of some of the requirements that are there. And I suppose we'll talk about the revocation of citizenship. I want us to focus on that a little bit later during our conversation, because it is the subject of whether Miguna Miguna did or not revoke his citizenship. And can somebody who is a citizen by birth revoke their citizenship? This issue is not just about Miguna Miguna, but it does talk quite a bit about other citizens who hold dual citizenship. We'll also be discussing other issues at the heart of this case. court orders and what they mean, and indeed what the next step is, according to the Cabinet Secretary for Interior, who now is expressing his displeasure with the manner in which what they termed today as judicial officer, probably referring to the judge in this case. My guests tonight are here to weigh in on this issue. So let's get to that conversation now. Steve, I'd like to begin with you. Is dual citizenship at the heart of this case with Miguna Miguna, or is it something more? What are your thoughts?
It gives us an opportunity to bring clarity on the issue surrounding Miguna's presence and forced exit. Now, what we must understand is this is a country. The question as to whether Miguna is a citizen or not is not yet before court. We are dealing with the processual issues, the processual safeguard, procedural safeguards as provided by the law, which was violated. And I just wanted to say that even before I give my own a detailed and in-depth analysis, that because of the confusion around Miguna's deportation, return, and forced return, it's very important that we know the frameworks around which we operate. And I want to highlight two premises within which my contribution will be based. Number one is that the Constitution and all the structures under it, especially the judiciary, is binding. The outcome of judicial determination is binding. That's the first premise. And the second one is that once there's a judicial determination, every other state officer must begin to act in compliance. So I want to analyze the processual issues around Miguna's presence in Kenya and his forced exit around those premises. Now, if you look at our Constitution, in terms of the hierarchical order, it is the judiciary that has the mandate to interpret the Constitution definitively. The Constitution and all the laws. So if the judiciary says, do not remove Miguna from the jurisdiction, the state officers are supposed to act in compliance with that interpretation of the law. Don't tell us, as a country, that Miguna is not in the country, he's not in the other side of the airport. Listen, Kenya is a territory that is governed by laws. The interpretation of those laws is a function of the judiciary. Once the judge has said, do not remove Miguna, and he was forcefully removed, how he came back, you can't ask someone who has returned when he was illegally removed to present his passport. So in terms of procedure, the requirement that Miguna ought to have presented his passport for stamping presupposes that his exit in the country was lawful. You understand? If he was unlawfully removed against a court order, and he happened to have returned, what the government ought to have done is to allow him to get in and settle, then allow the processual issues around the cancellation of his passport and his national ID to take place with the benefit of due process.
Okay, so what you're saying is that we're facing issues of procedure because the matter of his citizenship is what is pending before court.
What
right?
we're dealing with, let me clarify, there are issues of procedure because the manner in which Miguna was arrested, detained, and deported without due process. The courts are saying that because he's entitled to due process, let him remain within the jurisdiction. No court has said or made a determination that Miguna is a Kenyan citizen or otherwise. No.
Okay. So what you're saying, Steve, is that is for the court to decide?
At a later stage, once the processual issues have been dealt with, when the question emerges, and I'm sure you're going to bring it up and we'll highlight, if the question truly emerges, now that for purposes of demonstration, let's say if Miguna were in this country, pursuant the court order, and government respected that court order, not trying to explain it away, then the question that would have still emerged would have been this. Did Miguna acquire a foreign citizenship or not? If he did, when did he do it? And if we look at the time he did it, did the Kenyan law allow for that or not? Then you might say, if the Kenyan law did not allow for it, then automatically he lost it. Then did he regularize, the process of regaining his citizenship?
All right.
Now, those are the substantive issues.
I see.
Yes.
But that is an interesting one. So let's speak to Ndegwa on this matter about whether a citizen by birth can lose their citizenship of that country at any point. Because, there's a lot that's being said on social media, even by Miguna Miguna himself.
Yes.
But if I was born in this country, can I at any point lose my citizenship for whatever reason?
May I say that's a very interesting question, and Kenya is being faced with a very extraordinary scenario, knowing that there's never been any vigorous adjudication in our courts as to a question that is dealing with citizenship. This is the first time our courts are being faced with that issue of citizenship, of course, arising also from the enactment of the new constitution and the privilege of dual citizenship. The constitution is very clear that a state, or for a state to acquire its statehood, it must have its nationals. And so there is a presumption in law that any person who finds himself in the jurisdiction or in the region which has been declared or which has proclaimed itself to be a state, there is a presumption even in the international law that that state, for it to acquire the status of a state, must have its nationals. And therefore the presumption is that whoever finds himself in that region then is a national of that state by birth. So when we were enacting our new constitution, when you look at chapter 4, and chapter 1, and chapter 2, and most importantly, you look at Article 14. Then you look at the Kenyan Citizen and the Immigration Act. Then you read Section 30 of the 6th schedule to the Constitution. Is very clear. It has defined as to who is a citizen by birth. And Section 30 of the 6th schedule says that any person who was within the Republic of Kenya as at 11th December 1963, and any person who was, whose parents was nationals of Britain or England or an English colony, those persons who find themselves here, or by virtue of their birth, their parents who are in those British colonies, they are presumed to be citizens by birth. Okay. And therefore, there is that protection that you can never lose your citizenship if you are a citizen by birth. For one thing...
So even if you were to revoke it?
There can never be a revocation of citizenship by birth. And that is a philosophy that is advanced or propounded by Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is one of the naturalist philosophy and the one who lead one of the schools of law called the naturalist schools of law. A naturalist says, and that is the thinking behind the enactment of the Constitution and Section 30 of the Constitution, that there are some things that happens by the natural course of God. That you found yourself here when Kenya was being declared a state. And therefore, for you, by that virtue, and because of the naturalization aspect that is granted by to a citizen by God, you cannot lose that aspect of citizenship.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
We will get back to that issue. And you know, what happens now, and now that we have an understanding of the issue of citizenship,
yes,
then what are the other issues that are involved in this case, particularly the big one of court orders that we have been speaking to? Dr. Fred Matiang'i today taking issue with the media, terming them as lords of impunity. That was that Standard newspaper headline. But then also the matter of court orders. Now, Sophia Wanuna, who's our lead reporter on the show, was following the events at Continental House today when they appeared before them. Sophia, let's get into the particular issue of the Cabinet Secretary not directly answering to the question of court orders and whether or not they obeyed them and why they chose to obey them or not, as they said when they made their case and their submissions before the Parliamentary Committee. Let's speak specifically about that. What did Cabinet Secretary Matiang'i have to say about the issue of court orders?
Good evening, Yvonne. Yes, the Cabinet Secretary Interior, Dr. Fred Matiang'i, alongside the Inspector General of Police, Joseph Boynet, and the PS Immigration, Mr. Kelango, appearing before the National Assembly Departmental Committee on Administration and National Security when the issue of court orders and the disobedience of the same came up. He said and spoke for his other two colleagues that they had not been personally served by the court order, saying they had not seen any of these orders. In fact, he went further to admonish some who he did not name, but talked about judicial officers who he says are in cahoots with lawyers as well as civil society and a section of the political class, and that they're making it almost impossible for the government to work by these orders that keep coming through. He also talked about that the requirement for him and the others to appear in court was meant to humiliate them, was meant to parade them, humiliate them, that when going further to talk about the Attorney General, the lawyer representing the AG's office, State Law Office, not being given an opportunity to speak during those proceedings where they were found guilty of contempt of court. But Yvonne, you will remember the reason this lawyer was not given permission to speak in court was because the petitioners had argued that if in fact several court orders before this had been disobeyed, that they'd been asked to appear and had not appeared, then they should not be given audience, that the only way a contempt of court finding is purged is when that is purged is when then one can be allowed to speak. And this argument, it was made by the lawyers representing Miguna Miguna, it was granted, and that is why he was not allowed to speak. So in as far as court orders, the CS Interior going a long way and extensively talking about the frustrations he says they're experiencing, saying something must be done to ensure that this, he called, unholy relationship existing between those parties I mentioned should be stopped, for there to be a cohesive relationship, saying that whilst many opinion makers will talk about checks and balances, he kept emphasizing the importance of remembering the balances part, saying that there's a lot of checking on the executive, but the balancing part is largely been left out. But remember, Yvonne, this is not the first time we've seen that argument of court orders coming into play. There have been several other occurrences. The letters we've seen, for instance, from the Secretary General, Jubilee Party, the President's Party, writing to the judiciary, the Chief Justice complaining and raising issue with several of the orders, several of the matters, and even specific judges, one of being Justice Odunga, who perhaps now it may be a relief for some of these individuals because remember there was that reshuffle a little bit earlier by the Chief Justice. So this was his last matter at the Judicial Review Division here in Nairobi. He's set to be moved to Machakos, and taking that position will be Pauline Nyamoya. So clearly, there's still going to be a lot of concerns around those orders. And in fact, he said, C.S. Matiang'i, that he was set to write a complaint, an official complaint to the Judicial Service Commission through the Attorney General. I checked with the officers there, our sources indicating no complaint yet had been filed. However, from the JSC maintaining the government cannot write to argue or complain about a ruling of the case. The JSC mandate does not extend to decisions made in court. They can question conduct, and that can be investigated, but not ruling, saying that, in fact, the legal process provides for appeal. And so instead of raising an issue off of one court, if they're dissatisfied with the same, just like every ordinary Kenyan, the same should be pursued through other legal processes. So that conflict and collision path the judiciary has been with the executive appears to be far from over.
That's right. I just want to ask you the last one, Sophia. PS Kihalangwa said they did everything they could to facilitate Miguna's regularization of citizenship, and those are some of the terms that we will be speaking with our advocates. But he went, into some great detail and about that, and about Miguna Miguna's conduct and what he did and did not do, and whether he complied or didn't with the authorities.
Yes, the PS, Principal Secretary Immigration, saying that in fact it would have been a matter that would have quickly ended had Miguna Miguna submitted his Canadian passport, which was the document of travel. He chose not to do that, and Kihalangwa highlighting that it would have set a wrong precedence for him to be allowed into the country without, the due process, which is stamping of that documentation. And what Miguna Miguna was waiving and was insistent on using, which is his identity card, Kihalangwa today saying that as well is invalid. That in fact, as you mentioned, if he wants to regularize his nationality and citizenship in Kenya, he'd have to follow due process and apply for Kenyan citizenship as well. So the CS Matiang'i also weighed into that, saying that in fact earlier some of Miguna's lawyers had said that the authorities had confiscated his Canadian passport, and he says he's now been vindicated. They have been vindicated because he in fact used that passport to travel from Dubai back to Canada. So saying that this would have been a very easy process had due process been followed. And even Boynet, who was there, saying their efforts at the airport were simply to facilitate and help with the immigration department. But all of this, Yvonne, important to note, is its implication beyond this matter we're discussing, the issue of, the review that now will be taking place with the direct flights that are supposed to be starting from the US to Kenya. That such a debacle and spectacle that was witnessed on that day has the United States having second thoughts about how affairs are being run here. And of course, there are those who blame the media for that. And also that the coverage of the same happening there, the CS insisting even on whatever happened as far as the media is concerned, and the beatings that we saw as well is being investigated by Internal Affairs Unit and IPOA. But important as well to note is that the officer in charge, the police boss at JKIA, has since been moved from the airport.
Thank you. Indeed, there is a bigger picture to this entire conversation. Thank you for putting that into context. Sophia Wanuna, our lead reporter on the show this evening. My guests are still with me tonight, and that is Steve Ogola and Ndegwa Njiru. Steve, I want to read you, or rather there was a statement that was made by the Principal Secretary for Immigration. He said, and they quoted it on Twitter, Miguna's ID is invalid, and if he decides to regularize his citizenship, he will have to go through a process to regularize it. So in the context of what we've been discussing with respect to dual citizenship, what is your position on this issue? His ID is invalid. That's one question. Yes. We'll get to the implications of it in just a moment. But then his ID would now be invalid?
That observation is very correct, unless Miguna can demonstrate that he actually got that ID through the laid down processes. If he can't demonstrate how he acquired his ID, his name, and his name is not in the system, and he has an ID, of course it will be invalidated.
But was it invalidated by the dual citizenship with the change in the Constitution?
Yvonne, listen, let me clarify this. And this is a practical sense issue. First of all, you asked the question about whether a Kenyan can renounce. Of course, yes. Anybody is at liberty to renounce his citizenship, whether you're a Kenyan by birth or not. I can decide I don't want to be a Kenyan and go and acquire citizenship of another country. What the government is not allowed to do in post-2010 dispensation, the government cannot rob me of my citizenship by birth. They can't. But if I want to surrender it, it's open to me. It's just as simple as that.
And how would one revoke it before we move?
You see, the thing is this. Our constitution before 2010 did not recognize dual citizenship.
Yep.
If you acquired the citizenship of another country, you lost yours automatically.
Okay.
Now, we have dual citizenship. If you acquire Canadian citizenship, and then later on the US citizenship, of course, you stand to lose Kenyan citizenship because you have to choose then between US and Kenyan where you want to belong. The moment you choose Canada and the US, you make a decision to lose Kenyan citizenship. What we are referencing is this, and it's a very plain point, Yvonne. The thing is this. The question whether Miguna acquired these national identification documents, including the passport and the national ID, through due process is a valid question. And I think if the government is saying that they have a problem with that because they can't find his name in the system, they can't find his application. The only known way, because Miguna acquired the Canadian passport in 1988. Fact is, as that of 1988, the Kenyan Constitution did not recognize or allow dual citizenship. If you make a decision, whether by compulsion or otherwise, to acquire a foreign nationality, of course you make a conscious decision knowing that you stand to lose your Kenyan citizenship.
Okay.
Because how do you defend that? But post-2010, the law now says there is a format to follow. You want to reinstate or regularize your Kenyan citizenship, you fill some forms,
Okay.
You deposit them. Now,
All right, I think that is understood.
Yes.
Just hold that thought, because Ndegwa, the question then that comes to mind when the PS Kihalangwa says that his ID is invalid,
Yes.
is that not an indictment on the police service? Should Miguna Miguna not then be presented in a court of law
Yes.
and charged with, I don't know, fraud?
Yes.
And then does it also not raise questions about how the IEBC was able to clear him to run for office?
Exactly, Yvonne. And the Miguna Miguna saga should not be looked like an isolated issue. It is we need to have a multifaceted approach in trying to analyze the way our institutions work in this country. May I say that if Miguna Miguna's ID is fake, as we're being told, the question is, who issued him with this ID, and what actions have been taken against the person who issued this ID to Miguna Miguna? The thing that it goes further then to mean that if his ID is fake, what of his passport? Who issued him with the passport? Has the government taken actions against the person or the persons who issued him with the said passports? Does the government recognize that a crime that is cognizable in law has been committed for issuing documents to foreigners? And the question is, how do our systems work insofar as vetting and screening persons in this country is an issue? May I say that it takes us then to the question of the IBC and the way the IBC dealt with the whole election. Remember, before you are nominated, there is a requirement for you to do what is called the declaration forms. Are those forms, which are statutory forms of any relevance, and are they put into the proper and the good use for which they are intended? When Parliament enacted those laws, the election laws, and it was required of any person intending to vie or contest in an election, for him to declare, it was then purposed for the purposes of screening. Did the IBC then abrogate its duties? And if the IBC has abrogated its duties in this respect, what is the legitimacy of that institution moving forward? And the other question that begs an answer is, could there be many more Migunas who were elected pursuant the clearance of the IBC? And the question is, as we blame the IBC, we also have to look at where those forms were deposited also.
Right.
These forms were also deposited with the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission. What is their work? Are they sleeping on their job? And when we look at the Miguna Miguna's issue, it takes us back to the question of the census of 2009, which were never declared, for reason that we could not be able to know or tell who was a legitimate Kenyan and who was not a legitimate Kenyan. The question is it only Miguna who is an illegal immigrant in the Republic of Kenya, or there are others who are also loitering around and they have not actually been checked?
Okay.
So the Miguna Miguna saga is a sympathetic situation in the Republic of Kenya. It is telling us that our institutions are not working to the expected perfection. Two, it tells us that these institutions are not working in harmony and in unison. And
all right.
We need
and that is interesting, because the Cabinet Secretary, Dr. Fred Matiang'i, did speak about, collaboration and working together,
yes,
especially when he was speaking with respect to the relationship between the executive
yes,
and the judiciary in
yes,
that matter.
Yes.
I want us to pause there for a moment, take a quick break, because now we're starting to understand some of the issues that are at heart in this case, and that it's not necessarily about one individual, but it has far bigger implications. We'll also be talking a little bit about the other issues, court orders. When do we obey them? When do we not? Who gets to interpret them? And what do we do when we're unhappy with court orders that are issued? Both of you are advocates of the High Court. I'm sure this is something you definitely want to weigh into. And we ask you as well at home to do so. The hashtag is The Big Story. At KTN News, at Yvonne Okwara, I'm seeing some of your feedback. I'll get to that when we return from the short break.